All right. Hello, hello. We are back again for another Other Ink Thursday, and I have two guests again for the spooky month. We're going to talk about tarot cards are spooky, right? This is what we're going to talk about. We got uh game designer uh Savage and publisher Moth Rodriguez here from Galileo Games, and we're going to talk about The Old Ways Must Go here in a little while, but before that, oh, there it is on camera. It's speaker mode, so you're going to say something. You can show it off.
Yeah, so cool. Yeah, so it's
Yeah,
spooky.
it's spooky month. Uh,
That was the goal.
right. Ostensibly for spooky month, we're kind of pushing the definitions a little bit because this isn't exactly like a horror game in any sense. This is not a thing, but the like changing your mind and there's a witchy vibe to it a little bit. It is sort of within the broader remit of the spooky season. And also the other thing is it just came out. So this is why I want to talk to you now about it just coming out, right?
Yeah,
It was on crowdfunding like earlier this year, right?
right. Yeah, we had originally tried to blast it out for actually last October, and like did a bunch of like kind of the old just excitable mistakes. Like did not have nearly enough like lead up time to let people
Mm.
know that it was happening. So it made it about three-quarters of the way and like pooped out. Like it's fine. So we
So the first
relaunched it.
campaign was an elaborate marketing campaign for the real campaign.
Right. There was the ARG of signing up for the mailing list. That's actually what it was.
Yep.
Very, very clever, not at all embarrassing. It's super fun.
Uh,
Um, but so we relaunched for what was it? Zine
Quest.
Quest.
Yeah, in
Zine
Zine
Quest.
February.
Zine Quest in February. So we ran the
or Zine Month if you don't want to limit it to just things happening on Kickstarter.
or
Yeah.
yeah, Zine Month, Zine Adventure.
Yeah.
So yeah, we relaunched it for Kickstarter's Zine Quest timing, since we were doing zine format
Yeah.
books, and we did three of them, all sort of centered around the idea of tarot cards, but primarily looking at the old ways must go.
Yeah. So we're gonna get into it all in a little bit, but we're gonna before we I have this terrible habit of like jumping to like one thing to talk about it, but I don't set it up properly. So like game designers start somewhere. Where did game design start? And I Moth, I've talked to you before, and I don't even know the answer to this question, but I definitely don't know the answer for you, Samphire. Like what game design, like where does it come from? Why do you make games at all? Like where does that impulse come from generally? I mean, maybe this is the first one. I know nothing. Tell me everything. Tell me everything.
I mean, this is kind of my first published game.
It is,
Yeah,
if it,
I mean, we don't count
Wow.
conversational shrapnel,
That's a
but it's fine.
very
That's fine.
small
Yeah,
game.
that's a very small
it's a very
game.
small game.
Yeah. Um, so if you had asked me 18 months ago if I was a game designer, absolutely
Mm.
not. Like, nope, not me. And that would have been a very true statement. I have, for the past decade, been in a gaming community where I've been involved with a lot of people in the game publishing world, game designers, game publishers. That's how me and Moth met, and a bunch of my adult friends. And so I've been used to playtesting friends' games and getting to see early peaks of games before they
Mm.
go live. And really was kind of blind to how cool that was, right? Like these are just my friends. They make games. Don't all of your friends who play games make games? And was just kind of like, they're playing games with my friends at events and in little local collectives. And one of my friends has for years told me I should write a game, and eventually was like, okay, no, actually you need to go to this event. And so last year, I was lovingly pressured into attending a game jam, a 2-day game jam called Clitical Hits. Have you heard of this?
No, no, it's a fantastic
Oh
pun.
gosh,
I can
it's
put
so good.
together some of the focus based on based on that name.
Yeah, so I'm a professional sex educator, and Clit Hits is a game jam that brings together sex educators and game designers to
That's
learn with and from each other
Mhm.
for 2 days, and then make tiny little games. So my first game is actually one that I made from that game jam called The Gray Area, which is a consent education game that we pushed out as part of that project. And I love this group so much. I think it's John Lutz and who else runs that? I'd have to look. But they John is part of Planned Parenthood of the Midwest and was basically like, a game jam for sex ed is really great because sex ed is really almost criminally bad in this country and probably in a lot of places. So even if you make a bad game, you have significantly increased the quality of sex ed in this country, right? So,
yeah,
It's,
I can't disagree with any of parts of that analysis.
yeah. So last summer I attended that virtually. I was in New York, and even of the morning of, I believe I was saying to you, I'm not a game designer, I don't know what I'm doing here. And you were like, shut up.
I'm like, okay, so what I said was, right now, what that means is you haven't designed a game, but what you bring as a knowledge base is understanding of incentives and understanding of systems, and you already do the thinking as a game designer does. You just haven't put it in that context. Like, you're gonna be fine. You're gonna be like so actually comfortable once you start talking about the game design, I promise.
Well,
I already know that you think this way.
Yeah. And that was last July.
Well, so I imagine that you talked about the group of people and being in playtests and stuff like that of unfinished games. So I mean, this is obviously sort of like approaching a straw man argument, but I imagine if you only play like polished box sets at like monthly gaming group or whatever, and you see the person who's got, that's what you think of as a game, is this like packaged deal that's published by a big publisher that's got the dice and the cards and the it comes in shrink wrap, and like that's a game. How could I ever make one? But if you're like used to playing like, I scratch this down on a one sheet of paper here, everybody, like I don't know, here, draw a tarot card, and that'll be your character, and then we'll see what happens with these, the
Yeah, or
bar of
Jason
like,
Morningstar coming up and being like, here's a game about gnomes and silly hats. Want to play it? Right? Like,
right. I mean, like the idea of playing things that are unfinished shows you how much you get started with seeing a game before, because every game goes to that stage, right? Even the ones that end up in a big fancy box with
Yeah.
a nice cover on it, they started at some point with like some notes on a piece of paper, so like seeing it
Yeah.
from the beginning, like you kind of are like got to see behind the curtain before you knew it was a curtain or whatever from game design perspective. So
And
I
I think I
totally
didn't
see
even
that you were
I
prepped
didn't
for
even
it.
always know that I was playing unfinished games, right? Because we're just handing out slips to people, and then next year you come back and somebody's got a different version of the game. So that's just how games work, right?
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, it is how games work or can
yeah.
work, so
So,
so you
but
were definitely prepped for this.
yeah. And to Moth's point, so my professional background is in public health social work. And I've worked in state and federal government doing policy design. And so policy design is high risk, sometimes low reward incentive design, really,
Yeah.
right? And behavioral epidemiology, which I did a bit of, and even like disaster response. These are all things where you're trying to figure out how do you move people through a space in a certain way to get them to do the most helpful thing possible, while also making them feel like they have complete choice, right? Not to be
Yeah.
cynical about policy or public
Whoa.
health, but we right, education, setting up good frameworks,
Yeah.
incentivizing people to do the healthy thing for themselves,
Yeah,
communication, all of that.
yeah.
So I hadn't really considered that actually
I mean,
set me up really well for this. And my friends who were like, how did you get to being a game designer? I'm like,
yeah.
nobody's dying. If I write a bad game, nobody's gonna die.
Well, that's the thing that I was going to say.
Easy
The
mode.
stakes are so much lower for like a
Yes.
role-playing game than like you have been in, as you just said, like designing
Yes.
games, but like they're not really called games because they have such like, they have dollar stakes, they have like emotional stakes, they have like, legislative, or there's like a process involved, there's stakes there, but like a game is like so much less stressful, even but you know, it should be anyway.
My first live action role play was doing a live drill for a bomb threat disaster on the Ben Franklin Bridge, where we
Yeah,
had character actors and all that kind of, right? Like, because they do this in public health.
right.
So
That's
yeah, I
yeah,
learned tabletop RPGs from public health community planning.
yeah. That's I mean, yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
I once this isn't even related, but I there was basically somebody. I have a document on my computer of somebody who did that exactly what you're talking about, and then he's like, "How do I make this into like Tolkien's First Age game?" And he had like this like weird half designed role-playing game that was all basically like a rewriting of exactly the kind of like public health large scale LARP. And it's like this is you haven't gotten all the way there yet, but it's like yeah, it's like
Yeah.
you had to design a very large scale LARP to get there at all. And amazing.
Yeah. And then
Amazing.
additionally, I became a sex educator in college. I was at Rutgers and there was a whole program for that. And part of what not like an academic program, but a club. And part of the skills our sex ed crew learned and were given and taught were improv skills. So we were doing sort of street theater stuff for sexual health education at Rutgers University. And so here's this other tool bag that just got gifted to me in the way back that is really useful in designing games.
Yeah.
And with policy world as well, working in state government in particular, you're oftentimes designing things on short timelines with few resources, right? They're going to tell
Sure.
you don't have the budget for that. So working within constraints has been fundamental to how I've worked. I've not been used to having all the money or resources or people I want to do a thing.
Uh-huh.
So
Well, most role-playing game designers don't have that either. So
right.
you're right.
Right, but
You're
like
right in
at the
line.
scale when you can imagine like
Mm,
what it means to have resources in this context, and instead of like implementing a policy that actually requires an enormous budget, you just tell people to imagine that you have these things,
right, right.
and it's complete freedom.
Yeah.
Right. It's the well, like microscope, right? Is like, you know, like we're creating a whole history and like it's as big as the cosmos and like, oh, and then there was a whole other age. I'm just gonna put down a card and there it
Right,
is.
I
And
put down
Yep.
a card, not
Yep.
like I have to go fight with like Jamie Raskin for like a seat on the budget panel.
Right. Yeah.
uh
Yeah.
so I mean that's great. That's like of course you ended up as a game designer. You know all these game designer friends, and then you're doing this high level and then it is. So I I want to hear more about how like this is the first one that you're really going to design, but we'll talk about that in a second because I want to switch back to you a little bit, Moth, and talk about
Yeah.
like because I don't know. I assume that you're like one of those like sort of so many people in the industry that like, oh yeah, I played games since I was a child and I came up, you know, and then I've been playing games forever and then I started making them and now I make them and like, but I don't even know if that's true. So
I
like,
mean, like it's sort of nominally true, right?
yeah.
Like, yeah, I've played games for a long time. Like I got into D&D when I was, I don't know, 11 or 12 and had some really memorably bad games of D&D, right? Like the kind of games that you remember from like, or that the kind of games that you imagine 11 and 12-year-olds playing who are like just starting to like be sexually aware, and it's
Mm.
terrible, right? And it's full of like let's go fight monsters and your characters die, and like it's stupid stuff, right? But like play games here and there, right? I actually was a really big CCG player for a long time, and I played a ton of different CCGs. Um, but what really pushed me into design was I was working as essentially a white glove technician, and I would travel all over the place, and I would install our big piece of technology at like television studios. And so I was the person on staff, and it was kind of like bleeding edge tech. So like we couldn't just send them a thing. It was a thing that I documented all of the construction of and a bunch of the details of, and like actually wrote like software usage manuals. And I was traveling all the time and listening to the Fear the Boot podcast a lot. Like as like speaking of parasocial, Fear the Boot were my friends, right? For a long time. And eventually I met them and like we actually became friends, which was great. So we turned the parasocial into an actual social. Um, but it was kind of a really, really lonely time. And because I was just kind of doing the same technical install over and over and over again, I was just starved for creative anything. And I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, I need to do something. I would like to do something complex that leans on a lot of different kinds of skill sets. Game design touches doing things like drawing, doing things like writing, doing things like sort of puzzling out mechanics, doing things like all of these things. And I just picked it.
It-
Kind of
well, and I guess it also like the production side, right? Because like I have
this was not even remotely associated with the production side of this.
oh, just the games
This was
itself.
like I want a complex creative space that I'm deciding to play in,
Yeah.
right? And I didn't think just like drawing or just writing was going to
It,
fill my own personal needs because um I'm a super generalist. I hate getting stuck in a single thing, which uh is a whole big problem for me because I'm pretty good at a whole ton of different things at this point. Um, like I've gotten better at game design, but like I'm pretty good at a lot of things.
yeah, you
Right. And that's its own unique kind of skill set, right?
yeah,
Like I
sure.
the I'm able to do a lot of different kinds of work. But like so I started basically just as a I started with it as just like here's a complex, meaty creative project that's what it was. It was just like keep my brain a little bit busy
Yeah.
and not in like I'm in a hotel eating at Denny's again
Again,
in a different city this time, I guess.
yeah.
Um,
I mean that
but that's how I started.
right. I mean that is I am broadly unsurprised to hear that that is how you describe like your way into game design. Because yeah, I mean that's after we've been on like leadership team at the IGDN together and we've hung
Right.
out at
Yeah.
cons and stuff like that. So I'm like, that sounds like that sounds like all the
This
stuff that
this fits.
this does. It does fit. It does fit. So, I mean, I don't necessarily want like the whole history of, I don't want to ask you what the whole history of like Galileo Games is, but like, I assume knowing like that whole, I know I've said this to other people who are in that like Brooklyn, New York, greater New York into New Jersey, and that's where Metatopia is. And like, there must
Right.
just be like, it just must be like a whole design space that like you can't help but run into each other and be in each other's lives and stuff if you're game designing out
I
in that little
mean,
section of the country.
at this point, that is more true than it used to be, right?
Mm,
When I was getting started, it was Luke Crane and Jared Sorensen were kind of the big deal uh, in New York, like local designers. Burning Wheel they did, and Jared did Inspectors, and I actually wrote a, a hack of Inspectors at one point in time, long, long time ago, um, that evolved into a game that never really quite made it to production because it didn't, eh, lots of reasons. Um, but yeah, like there was a lot of space to experiment with
yeah.
um, some of these things.
But I imagine like so like if you're with Galileo Games and like is that just sort of a natural outgrowth of those connections and like being now that you've decided, oh, I'm gonna make a
Yeah,
game and then like or is it
so like when through my early game design stuff, like I had come up with a design that I'm like, actually a lot of people like this. Like I was showing it at cons and showing it at like local board game nights. when I could get people to try a 2-person playtest. And I'm like, I wonder what it's like to produce a game. Kickstarter was kind of brand new at the time, uh, and my wife was actually in a design class, so I was absorbing lots and lots of information about paper specifications, and like it was basically like a package and production design class.
Okay.
Package design. So like I was just already absorbing a lot of information about just paperweight. And like I'm like, you know what, let's go for it.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I hired some people to like do some things, draw some stuff, and went to Kickstarter.
Yeah.
It was wild. I made a ton of mistakes. I ordered way too many games.
Oh, yeah. Bad.
Yeah. But like that's like with that and like Brooklyn Indie Games, which was like my first company, that was the start. And you know, I was kind of off to the races.
Yeah.
Doing game design and doing all of the production and like logistics and management of all of that, that takes up a lot of time. So
Sure.
while I continued designing a lot of things, a lot of this stuff that I made did not quite make it out to the light of day aside from like playtest groups. And then eventually, Brennan Taylor and I became friends over time, just being in the same circles, right? Like the New York, New Jersey, like convention scene and area. And, you know, over time, we were like, hey, do you want to work together? We already hang out a lot and like talk about games a lot and talk about designs a lot. And we decided to just join our companies.
Yeah. That
So
makes sense. That makes
yeah,
sense. Okay. I'm there's more details. Maybe I should have you and Brendan back on. We could talk more about like that origins, but I don't want to. I want to hear more
we're here to
about
talk about a
this.
different
We're here to
game.
talk about a different game. Like I do appreciate the like hearing how you came into things and got kind of started, but you suffice it to say, for the purposes of this interview, you were eventually in a place where you're like, oh yeah, we could do a zine. I've done Kickstarters before.
Yeah,
And so like what
I've done at least, you know, 7 or 8 at this point.
right. So like
Uh,
did you mention you two knew each other already or had met each other? So like did you see Samphire, did you have this game like kind of going and then you showed it to Tim and Tim was like, great, I'll publish it? Or was it sort of like
Oh no. So
was it was he like you should make a game and then you made a game and then like how did this game come
have
about?
you met Moth? Moth is trouble as in an instigator, right?
Yeah.
this is true.
And so less than a month after I had gone through that game jam and made my first game, and my friend is sitting here going, "Ha ha ha! You're a game designer."
Sucker.
I'm leaving. I live down near Baltimore, DC area, but I'm in New York a lot. And I was leaving New York, heading to Boston to visit some friends. Like I said, less than a month after this sex ed game jam, and you just pitched an idea at me. You were like, "What if we wrote a game that was about like
What if we made a game that was a ritual where you make rituals?
or a ritual about tarot cards. There was tarot and ritual was in there from the beginning.
But it was
but it was about making
it was
rituals.
about making rituals.
Yeah.
And so I pitched that as a concept.
And I don't think you knew this about me at the time, but I do my best work on trains. So about 70% of this game came out of my head onto my laptop in the next 3 hours
That sounds
of a
like an
5-hour train trip to
extremely I live
Boston.
in Baltimore, but I travel to New York a lot sort of thing.
Right. When do you have downtime on the train, obviously? And I used to live in New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey. So like this piece of the Amtrak has been my friendly neighborhood get stuff done. Even in my career when I was going to DC a lot for work, for federal stuff, right? So like I learned to use train time to do my work. And yeah, it was a long ride and I had a seat to myself. Haha, oops. And then I was coming back through New York and we had a play test, and 2 play tests within 10 days of doing the initial prototype. One in New York with you and Lisa, and then one in Philadelphia with a friend of mine who's a professor at the Wharton School and at the Boredom Brew that's right there in Philly, because I was stopping over to see her for dinner and I was like, I came up with an idea, I want to play. And we were like, whoa, this works.
Yeah.
It needed a lot more tweaking and we took it to Metatopia and stuff like that. But yeah, no, this was challenge accepted because trouble.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that's always so great when you're like, you have an idea. As a Midwesterner, the car ride is the replacement for train travel, right? So like somebody's driving and then I'm the one with the phone in the other seat, like, and then we could do this and like, yeah, that's a good idea, write that down. And so this is traveling to conventions, my business partner and I, like, we'll do this and we'll like, what if we do this? And what if we do this? And then like we haven't tried it yet. So like that moment when you're like, okay, we put all the pieces on the table now that we're in the hotel room or whatever, and like there's something here is kind of a very exciting moment when you get to a game where you're like, there's something here. We could develop it, right? It was a good idea to start, and then, maybe it'll take some tweaking, but like, that's always a good idea. So I guess, if we want to talk about I mean, we've talked a bunch already, and like, I want to be respectful of time and stuff like that, but like, do we want to talk about tarot cards just a little bit and like why?
Yeah.
I mean, is it obviously they're like, I can talk about why I like them, but this is your interview. So like, why is I mean, is it, without answering my own question, right? Tell me why tarot is so easy to like, just jump in and use as a thing, or what inspired you to use it, or whatever, like,
So we've both been like doing stuff with tarot for a fairly long time. I think roughly an equivalently long time.
Yeah.
And like from really different kinds of approaches, right? Like Sam has a really, really intuitive kind of approach where it's really kind of like art first, look for the like the symbology and meaning in the art without bothering to worry about what the card is, right? Like tarot is very, very structured, and it has a whole bunch of historic stuff going on with the like a classical structure, right? Which is kind of the way I started learning tarot, right? Like focusing on that structure, focusing on kind of the narrative paths of each of these things. And yeah, like our viewpoints are really lovely complementary, without stepping on each other's toes, right? So like we come at it from like entirely opposite ways, but like there's a really nice way that we meet in the middle in terms of like where we're interested in it. Yeah.
Do you yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to ask if you have a favorite deck that you want to like promote, or like a style of deck or something.
I have so many decks. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's this beautiful deck. I think we both have a copy by an artist and an author named Cedar McLeod, and the deck is called the Numinous Tarot. It's so gorgeous.
It's really beautiful.
It's really, really, really beautiful, and it's so hopeful and bright and inclusive. And I also have Cedar's Oracle deck, which is called the Threadbound Oracle, that's based off a book series that Cedar wrote.
Which is actually how I found
yes, yeah.
Right. Like I found a Kickstarter for their book,
The Thread That Binds.
The Thread That Binds.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is like the second one in what's called the Eternal Library series. And it's
about queer.
Yeah, it's about queer librarians.
Queer witchy librarians. It's so great.
It's so great.
Yeah.
And I'm like, this looks super cute. And I read it and I really liked it. I'm like, hey, Sam, I bet you'd like this. And Sam's like, oh, this is amazing. I'm like, Whoa, I was not expecting that.
Yeah, yeah.
But
And
then I
I'll
got
come back to why it's amazing in a moment.
I got Samphire, the Threadbound Oracle, which, as you said, was diegetic from the book, and it's rad. It's really interesting. It's sort of tarot-like in its structure, where it's got suits, but it's all about bookmaking, which is
Okay.
awesome.
And story
Yeah.
writing, right? And
It's-
this is, I've actually taken both Cedar's tarot deck and the Oracle deck now and made my own custom deck, blending the
love it.
cards from the set, like, because they're just so good.
Yeah.
And this is I love this too because the Oracle deck is about writing and making books. And my experience with tarot has always been in a more, I have a background as a counselor, a therapist. I teach in Jungian circles, right? So there's this sort of like collective unconscious, project, active imagination, all of this language that comes from that world, where I've always understood tarot as a way of having a conversation with the nonverbal part of your brain at its basis, right? It permission to sort of extrapolate, imagine, and get in contact with your gut, because what you see there each time is very much informed by what you're thinking, what you're feeling, and what's happening around you. And
Yeah.
that is how cards have always been used in some of the worlds that I've been in. And Cedar's cards in particular tell very specific stories, and the tarot tells a story, right? There's these cycles that happen in it, and then there's this meta story about the journey of the soul, and one can talk about Campbell or not, and the hero's journey, and why that's kind of borked, and why we need different models. But ultimately,
But I mean, the tarot predates even that structure.
Yeah.
The tarot way predates
Yeah.
Campbell, so don't
Yeah,
even.
exactly. It's a whole tangent that I'm not going to get on. But the idea that there are relationships between the images and the cards, and then relationships between the cards, and that when you lay out some cards, you're telling yourself a story, right?
Yeah.
And storytelling games are about telling a story.
Yeah.
Right? And one of the things that was important to me in designing this game is that people not need more stuff, right? There's enough stuff out there. And so many of my friends have 4 to 40 tarot decks. And everyone was like, you're gonna make a deck to go with this game? And I'm like, absolutely not. Nope, no freaking way. Not the point. And that each deck has a different flavor, right? So I wanted to build a scaffolding that people could use any visual cards with. Tarot was the jumping off point, but we've play tested this with Dixit cards.
I was going to say Dixit is like the big alternate.
So good. It was so fun.
I'm scheduled to go play Mysterium with some friends like later in a couple days, so it's like there are other games that use those image cards.
And there are games that use tarot that I love, but one of the things that some of those games, and I won't name them because I love the games and I'm not criticizing them, but some people have just used tarot cards as a randomizer, and I'm like, like as an alternative to playing cards. And there's so much more you can do with this imagery. They invite stories and they invite collaboration, and they
I mean, I think when you talked before about how like it's the unconscious conversation with your own, or the conversation with your own unconscious in that way, like I think I tend more to that direction of it, because like there's a reason why when you look at a card, you're like, this is what this means. I know exactly what this means today. And there could be any number of reasons why, based on, what it's meant to you before and what you're feeling that day or whatever. But like that initial impulse of that flash of like, oh, I know what this means. That's then, okay, but what does that mean is like more the interrogation conversation that you were talking about. I think that's, and changing out the deck and like, I mean, we should move more to talk about some of the actual pieces that are in the game, in Old Ways Must Go. But like one of the things that I really liked, one of the suggestions was like everybody gets their own deck, and then like you're mixing the cards together, and because you're each bringing your own thing into the conversation, because there are so many different styles of symbols and ways to present them and stuff like that. I have to I have to keep myself it's a habit. Buying more tarot decks would be a habit that I could easily develop. I'm trying to keep myself at a nice, reasonable number. But we'll see. We'll see. Um,
N+1
because
is a reasonable number.
Right.
That's how the bike people do it. N+1.
right, right. That's see, this is your instigator nature, Moth.
That's correct.
Yes.
This is the
Yeah.
instigator nature. Okay, so I want to hear very briefly, before we talk some more details of the game, why, I mean, other than the friendship that obviously you have, I'm witnessing your friendship here. You're talking about like, and then you told me to do this, and then we were together doing this. And so like, is it many of other Galileo games publications are sort of like the term muscular comes to mind, which is maybe a bad term, but they're like, bulldogs with exclamation points and katanas and trench coats. You know what this is about. And
Right.
and this is very much not that vibe. So like, is it just based on like you are, because it's you, then it is under the auspices of Galileo Games, or is it like a real business strategy on the part of Galileo Games to diversify from sort of the products that you've been releasing
I
recently?
mean,
Like,
that's a really interesting question because it's very funny to me that like you use the term muscular and no, it's
I
really
mean,
fun because one of the ways that in recent history, and this is I think like a little bit less true, is like Brennan and I were talking and like what is the thing? Like what is the brand promise of Galileo games?
mhm.
Right. And right, Bulldogs is a big one of that. And then like one of my first games, Omega Zone. And if you put Bulldogs and Omega Zone together, um, you kind of see a lot more hijinks than like muscular, right? And in a lot of ways, I feel like Katanas and Trench Coats and Thousand Arrows like really fit that like actually what we're going for is hijinks here,
Yeah, I
right?
can see that.
Like
I can see
Katanas
that.
and Trench Coats is a love letter slash send up of like 90s supernatural drama and like White Wolf games in particular, right?
Yeah.
Like it's it's a goof. It's like you start reading the book and you figure out very quickly that it's a goof, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, Thousand Arrows, for all that it is an absolutely sort of modern lensed historical game, is about important people with really big feelings and swords.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
And that's actually what that game is about.
I guess I take your pushback on my use of the term
No,
muscular, but
it's not pushback, right?
but
Like
but
because I think you're absolutely correct. Like Bulldogs has like this big sort of front to it, right?
mhm.
It's got that really kind of heavy duty, like rough and tumble imagery. Katanas and trench coats, absolutely, and Thousand Arrows too, right? Like the
Yeah.
first you think of is like that scene from Hero, right? I totally get it. I've never thought about it that way. That is the only thing that I'm saying.
So I like the so but like what I would say is I accept your like no, it's not like that, because there's this heart under them about the feelings, and then and that's totally true of like Thousand Arrows, and I'm sure of Katanas and Trench Coats, because like it's the, you know yeah, those, yeah, anyway, I but this game is like all feelings in some respects, where so it's like it's the perfect, it's without that facade, right? Like instead of
Right.
like we're going to make fun of the facade by like presenting the feelings, like we're not going to have a facade, it's just going to be the feelings. And so
Yeah.
it makes sense in that sense.
And it's interesting because like all of those games come from such different sources, right? Like Bulldogs is at its core kind of Brennan's baby, right? Omega Zone was mine. Omega Zone was like my uh oh man, I really liked Gamma World except for how the game played. Game. And then Katanas and Trenchcoats was Ryan's joke project originally. And then, we were talking and he asked me to come on as kind of a project manager. I'm like, look, I'd love to publish this, but it actually has to be a real game. And so we spent 2 years making it into a real game that was built out of like this joke concept.
Yeah.
And then Thousand Arrows was Brennan's idea, and it had originally been a Legend of the Five Rings hack. And if you've read Thousand Arrows, there's a variant called Extreme Love Everywhere, which basically says one of your attachments is you're secretly in love with somebody else. And I remember playing sort of like a quick hack together sort of PBTA style version of Thousand Arrows, right? Like this L5R hack a long time ago. And it was so much fun, right? Like I'm secretly in love with this person. They're secretly in love with this person. This person's secretly in love with me. Those two people are secretly in love with each other and like have no idea, right? And we're all like being sort of like, people, important people with swords and big feelings and also secretly in love with somebody and all navigating that at the same time. And it's so wacky and so much fun, right? And then turning the game over to Mendez to actually write the game, like made this, like gave it this
He seems like
whole
a fan
other...
of shenanigans himself. So like,
I mean, he is a fan of shenanigans, but
and also
also
big feelings. He's
and
a
also
fan
big
of both of those
feelings.
things.
This is true. He is a bigger fan of cultural scholarship, I will say.
Indeed.
Yeah. So, I mean, he's nice enough, but like his hijink quotient is maybe a little bit low.
He he I don't know. So I talked to him at Gen Con last year, and he was telling me about how he had conducted like some impromptu martial arts demonstrations like in a green space like next to the convention center and stuff like that.
Oh,
And
Secret Fight Club, yeah.
I'm like, this is why I say that he's into shenanigans, right? So
I mean,
like
I'm so teasing. Yes, of
yeah,
course he's into shenanigans. Like we wouldn't have let him write Thousand Arrows if he wasn't.
right. Okay, so I wanted to turn the lids back. This back and forth interview style is going off the rails on me. But Samphire. So like having this, you've got this idea for the game, you've tested it out, it works. There's something there, like we talked about, and then like it's like the no edifice, the like pro shenanigans, the like big feelings game publisher that you've got that is like does it feel like that's what the game is about for you on that level, or like what is it that like you're like, oh well, obviously yes, you have to publish it because you understand what I've done, because you've got these like games about feelings, even though they got swords in them. No swords in this one, unless, well, there's swords because there's a whole suit of swords.
Definitely
There's definitely
versions with swords and poison.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
But I guess like, how do you feel from as the designer of the game, like that you match up with what Moth is on about here?
To be honest, I didn't give that much of a thought at the beginning. One, it seemed right to keep it in-house at Galileo because the idea of the game, like that one sentence pitch, came from Moth, and you actually had to talk me into the fact that I was designing the game. Like, I was like, this is your game, I'm helping. And you're like, you wrote this fucking game. Like, I'm just doing what publishers do.
What I did was I threw an idea at you. You then spent 3 hours writing a game.
And then many more iterating on it.
Yeah.
But I think what it was is that there has been such a long-term foundational sense of trust. And I have dealt in other worlds with having to deal with like publishing and communications and stuff like that. And I hate it. I really, really hate it. I'm not good at it. I'd rather just go do my thing and hang with my friends. And so the idea of not having to think about it. I mean, I obviously did have to think about it. I've been challenged to do many things I would have never thought I would have done last year, like interviews and stuff like that. But at the time, it was like, I trust this person not to screw me over.
Mm,
I believe this game comes mutually from our brain meats, and I have no clue what I'm doing.
yeah.
So if there's a person I trust who's willing to shepherd this, then I'd rather do that than try to figure out where it belongs and what to do with it. And the first Kickstarter was, I think, kind of meant as a time constraint, right? Like let's just get this thing done and see what happens.
If you put it on the schedule, then you got to finish writing it or whatever.
Exactly.
I mean, well, that was a tight schedule too, because that pitch was August.
Yeah, that was.
So
Yeah.
like between August and October of last year, like the game was
I mean, that's
based.
enough time to write a zine, but
And
just, you know.
what I think has really been super supportive for me, and I think you've probably seen this from Moth in the IGDN stuff, is that Moth is such a lovely mentor and coach
Mm,
and supporter of people's creativity and bringing them into the tribe, as it were. And um by making that kind of space, by having a friend who's a publisher who can introduce me to the challenges before I find them myself and help navigate that space with those kind of that know-how and that just genuine wanting to bring people in. That's what made me feel really, I wasn't thinking about how it fit in the product line. I was
mm,
just like, why would I want to have to go somewhere else
yeah.
to start this? And as I think about subsequent games, we've talked about how some of my other game ideas probably fit better with other publishers. But I think you just have a knack at finding potential and cultivating it.
Oh, how sweet. I mean, seriously though, I mean, it's
Yeah.
perfect. It's perfect. And okay, we've talked for a good long while now, and we haven't actually described Old Ways Must Go. I think we've talked about it and we've talked a little bit. So let me quickly describe for the listeners, anybody who's still watching the video, what is the gate? You described it earlier, Moth, as a ritual that makes rituals. So like it is you use tarot cards and you have a very particular order that you lay them out in. That's the ritual part of it. There's a very specific set of steps. I forget if it's 5 or 7 steps to the game, and you go through them, and that there's putting down of cards, there's canceling of cards, there's substituting new cards, there's sort of resolving everything. It is very much like a reading. It's a very advanced like tarot reading in a way, because you're putting down those cards in very particular places and they mean certain things, and you're claiming ownership over the cards, and you're always kind of keeping some, I think, I don't know if it's one of the variations or one of the things, but you've got a card that you kind of keep to the side, which is your card that you, and so that's the actions that you're actually doing at the table. But this what you're replicating is this idea of like, here is a ritual that is, it could be anything as big as as small as drinking a cup of coffee and as large as the way we organize the prison system or whatever, and both of them are ritualistic in a way because we've always done it that way, or we currently do it that way. And you offer the game as like a, okay, so what is good about that and what is changeable about that, and how are we going to be part of the change in the new ritual, and that we replace the old ritual with. The old ways must go. I mean, it's right there in the name. And I'm reading it and I'm like, and knowing your background now more, Samphire, I'm like, this is like, we keep calling it a game, but I can't tell if it's a game, right? Because it's like, I mentioned microscope earlier in the interview, and it is kind of has that sort of microscope feel to it, where it's like, okay, so we're going to make up any sort of world that has anything that we don't like, and then we're going to, yeah, whatever comes to mind is Avatar, right? So you got the 4 kingdoms and you got the different elements, and like, what if we're going to replace that? What would we replace it with? It's completely fantasy, and the roles that we're playing are like, well, I'm the I don't know anything about Avatar, so like, I don't know, I'm a guy with the big horn and I'm going to announce things and I blow the horn and there's this wind
Sure.
power, and that's who I am and that's what I can do, and so my new role will be to whatever. You could completely go fantasy world with it, but then I feel like it's also like perfectly applicable to be like, all right, friend, you've just broken up from like a 7 year on again, off again relationship, and like you're definitely not seeing that person anymore. So come over to my place. We'll do this ritual and we'll vision for the future about what like what your life could be like if you don't have to deal with that person anymore. You know, like it's like equally applicable as both like a complete fantasy and also like a very real world sort of like process. And so that's why I say like, is it even a game? And so anyway, I've now talked a bunch about the game yet more. So am I picking up on the right vibes of it? Is that have I missed any important details about how it works? Like correct my offerings now that I've described it. Like what have I gotten right? What have I gotten wrong about what I just said?
You're doing great.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
no, seriously, that is one of the brilliant things about the way this game is constructed, because right, the setup ask is for people to think about some sort of ritualistic space that went wrong for them, right? And this can be made up, right? You can like look at Avatar and be like, well, the Fire Nation is busy being assholes, right? And like that's a problem. And that's where I'm coming from. Like, and I'm only coming at it from kind of that fantastical viewpoint. And meanwhile, you might be like, 7 year relationship breakup. What are we used to go out as a thing every Friday. What do I do on Fridays now? Like my Friday nights are gone into the future. Like I have no idea how to like replace that empty space in my life, right? And so you're coming from that. And Samphire might be like, uh, you know what? I fucking hated church, right? Like this piece of church. And somebody else might be like,
So
I
what you're
read a book
saying is
that had
that
this
all of these
ritual.
people could be playing the same game
I'm
together.
I'm I'm explaining one game,
Yeah.
right? Right.
This is so you start with, so part of what I've realized as a game player and a game designer is a lot of people have trouble with game setup in coming up with like, what character am I going to play? What, right? Like, and this starts with take something very, very real and imagine it. And have kind of like a little bit of a bad feeling about it, actually, right? Because we're going to use that as fuel. We're living in challenging times, right? Everyone can think of something hard. But one thing I've known from doing collaboration work and counseling and somatics and all of this other stuff is that when we start to get caught in our bad feelings and in intensity of bad feelings, we lose the ability to connect and to imagine. When we're
Well, you shut
afraid,
down because you don't want to connecting
right,
is painful, so you shut
right,
off the
right.
connection.
Yeah,
I mean,
one might even say
as a
that
non-specialist,
yeah,
that's
yeah. People sometimes think that like um of if you think of opposite emotions like and emotional spaces, fear and curiosity are on opposite ends of the spectrum, right? When you're afraid, you retreat. When you're curious, you're coming forward. And so for people who, I wanted a game that people who don't think that they're gamers could play, but I also wanted a game that gamers could play,
Yeah.
right? Like it was like, and so to start with, I wanted then to people to be able to connect to something real and to come to their character way at the end, because like, who am I is like, bleh, right? At the beginning of this game, people pick a card that represents them in this moment. And that's only there for if at the end they want to reject what the community is offering them, right? You can always go back to where you started. You can stay where you are, and that is an acceptable exit from the game. But what we find is people find themselves transformed a little bit in the process of the game. So you're starting by creating a negative space, both artistically and imaginatively, right? Like a thing that went wrong. And instead of naming that thing, instead of having this crap fest where you all get caught up in how bad you feel about what happened.
About your real life thing versus this fantasy thing that you read about, right? Which is also like a potential space of conflict that is cleverly dodged.
Yeah, yeah. It doesn't even have to be real, right? Like you've got an out there, or it could be very real, and we're not asking you to say what happened.
Yeah.
We're allowing you to just pick a card from the few that are in your hand and tell us about a piece of what happened, right? One little piece, not the whole story, because if we get in the story, we see our differences. If we say one piece, then we lay these down, each of us taking a turn, naming a different aspect of it. And these are pieces that you find in rituals and community-oriented engagement around the world. You find that there is a goal for a ritual, right? That a ritual is formed around communities, that there are material components, and that there is symbols that we use to represent certain things. So those are the 4 quadrants. And you name something that's broken in each of those, and then we invoke, right? We create a quasi-ritual space because our brains like this, right? Like, and so we're building connection through naming what doesn't work. And then the rest of the game is actually problem solving. I have a couple of friends, because of where I live, in the intelligence community, and they're like, these are just pure analysis, right? That your games you design are thinking frameworks, like, and I'm like, yes, but they're fun thinking frameworks. They're also really serious thinking frameworks in that they can be used. We have used them to decompose a single community event that kind of exploded and give people a lot of time to talk about that without going back to that moment in time. We invite the opportunity for repair in this game, and that's entirely what this game is about. And I feel like there's a lot of games that are about fighting and conflict, and I'm really curious about games that are about helping people understand who they are in the context of their communities, and about how do we collaborate and how do we build from what we have.
And if that's not shenanigans, I don't know what is.
I mean, I think it is the, this is like the people who were, whatever. This is like the magic in some ways is like just, it's changing the world, but it's changing how you think about the world. And that also therefore is changing the world, right? It is sort of like been in some ways sanitized in that way. Nobody's making pots. Somebody's trying to make lead into gold, right? That is not the sort of way that a lot of people. I'm sure there's still some people who are doing that sort of ritual transformation sort of stuff. But so many.
Honestly, like that actually sounds like the battery industry right now. That is literally what the battery industry is trying.
Anything here, we're doing emotional composting.
Emotional composting. I really like that as a better way to say the thing that I'm trying to say about like how it is sort of like, and again, I think it rides even as you described it. I still remain unconvinced about like whether it's on one side of the line or the other. I think it is pulling in a lot of elements from, like you said, from your therapy experience and you've got friends in the intelligence community and frameworks of thinking about things and like the like you were talking about state level, law, legal frameworks and stuff like that. There's a lot of like things that this experience would ride between, and like only somebody that's got a foot in all of those worlds could kind of produce this small little zine that kind of synthesizes all of those ways of thinking, I think. Which is great because it's such a neat thing. It's I don't know, you've mentioned Jason Morningstar already. He uses the word technology to talk about like things you do at the table, and I think this is a technology I haven't seen before exactly in the way that you're trying to compost emotions. So I think it's pretty fascinating. We talked for almost an hour now, so I do want to begin to wrap up, but I do want to give you a little bit of time to talk about the other things. So you've shown it off. We talked about The Old Ways Must Go is the little zine-sized book, but there's like 3 zines that were produced by this crowdfunding campaign. You've got a tarot book, because when you get a tarot deck, you got to have a book that goes with the deck to like describe what it is. So like, is it your interpretation of the 78 cards, and that's
so the Optimist Guide to Tarot like comes out of largely my practice of reading tarot and my irritation with like the concept of bad cards, right? Because there's a lot of bad cards, right? Quote unquote, like super scare quotes in tarot, right? 5s are terrible, 7s are bad, Like,
Oh, you don't want the swords.
you
Yeah.
don't want the swords. Like, that'll mess you up.
You could
I'm
reverse
like,
cards, or they're often
Yeah.
described as ill aspected if they're
right, yeah.
come
Right,
out
right, right.
upside
I'm like,
down.
number one, throw out that nonsense.
Yeah.
Like, that's screw your inverted cards. I hate that anyway. I don't want to memorize 156 things now.
Come on,
That's
there's like 700 Pokemon. You can do
yeah.
it.
I mean, I don't memorize those either. Like, no shade, but like, I got better things to do with my time,
Yeah.
and I want to respect other people's time in that fashion.
My uh my hack for that is that if it ends up upside down, it's like you're more responsible. Like if it's right side up, it's like this is a thing that happened to you. And if it's wrong side up, it's like you made
pointing
this
right
happen
at
to
you.
you.
It's
Like you
pointing
have
at you.
Yeah.
It's like you did this.
Yeah.
You did this to you.
you did this to you.
I mean,
But
that's fair. Like, but like, so where I come from with like the way that this book is constructed, it's a really optimistic look.
mhm.
That's it, right?
Yeah.
That's the core of it, right? Like, I try to explain why I think some of the cards are interpreted as bad, and talk about how they're trying to help, and how and what they're actually being about. And like, we looked at like no fewer than 3 different decks, and as many as 6 in a lot of cases, to look at like what the art was saying, right? Um, what the art is showing, and what kind of the story is across a bunch of different interpretations, to try and sort of suss out what the commonalities are. Where 5s are almost always bad. Like, 5s mean change. 5s mean difficult change, right? Like, this is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just disruptive. And if you're
Yeah.
just like, if you're hell bent on being in your own rut, yeah, then they're gonna suck.
Yeah. And then there
Almost,
was for me there was a lot of just sort of updating some of the classical interpretations and filling in the gaps where you were like, I hate this card too much, I don't want to write it.
Right.
So this was mostly a long-term project of yours. So to back it up a little bit, when we did the second Kickstarter, we had some time, and I had kind of gone back to Moth and said, I don't think this is just a ritual game we've made. I think we're looking at using tarot in transformational ways. And then when Zine Quest came up, it was like, wait, we've got more to say by the time the second Kickstarter came around, and we wanted to offer more as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you already had this in the works, and it gave us, again, a deadline to finish that up and put it into layout out and really get your ideas out.
Mhm.
And so I think we sort of switched roles here, and I was sort of your
Super much.
coach and ally and provoker. And then in that process too, the third zine, which is about to be
There it
released, is
is.
called In Good Company. And it's conversational templates. And this came out of, as we were making this game, we started playing with tarot way more, and we started inventing some of our own layouts. And
Mhm.
ultimately, I realized that what we were doing, and what is a little bit different but in line with the game, is all of these layouts are, again, conversational tools. The game is a conversational tool at its basis,
Yeah.
right? For group collaboration and ideation. I've done a solo spread to help give myself constraints for a short story I'm writing that's due next week, right? Like, you can use it in lots of different ways. But that a lot of tarot is taught and practiced for one, or for one person reading for another person. And instead, that third zine is really about realizing that in our own friendship, we've learned how to sort of have important conversations, whether that's like, how do I deal with convention drop, or like, how do we what do we need to focus on in the next couple of months as collaborative conversations. And we say this in the intro to the zine, there's when you have these templates, when you have a way of laying out cards, you're literally able to put your cards on the table, right? Like, you are seeing together both that there is a contained structure for the conversation we're having and a path through. And this was a thing we discovered as a side effect of making the game.
Yeah.
And felt like it was worth sharing as well. So that's where that collection has now become Tarot for Transformation, because each of these things kind of look at it and say, how do we make a better use of it in a modern lens? How do we make it into a game?
Yeah.
How do we make it into, I would say, not even so much optimist as like hopeful and relentlessly kind interpretations,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Mm.
And also, like, how do we give people more tools to have what might feel like hard or difficult to vocalize conversations? So
Yeah.
they all kind of nest together really nicely.
Yeah. I mean, that all sounds amazing. When I got the thing, I backed the game and I wanted this one and the Old Ways Must Go. And then there was like, oh, but you could choose one of these other two instead. And I was like, a choice of three. I didn't realize that. And it was but they all sound amazing. And I hope that they're all available. And I'm sure that that's the wisdom of
Even
the
as you
experience, right? I mean, you're
join
gonna
Kickstarter backers, they will be more
Yeah,
publicly
which should
available.
hopefully be by the end of the month.
Hopefully, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and yeah,
But
so
there sounds like there's such an potential for an afterlife, right? Of this sort of this thing. Like it is, I mean, there's that 1,000 new games every week on Kickstarter, right? And but you're again, because you're offering something that isn't just purely a game, you're offering this sort of like you say, this Tarot for Transformation. This is sort of like a package, like, put the paper strip around the three zines and
So,
sell them together, right?
so one of the things that has come up in the course of developing this game and just like generally talking about tarot a lot, and like especially once we got the idea of Tarot for Transformation as a collection and possibly an ongoing collection, um, is this idea of, I forget
do
exactly
you
where it came from, but like you had, I think, told me a story about um, a deck of cards that was representative of
it's
different
in
points in,
the short story I'm writing.
it's in the
Yeah,
short
yeah,
story you're writing,
yeah, yeah.
right? So
So
it's this deck of cards that is a collection of pieces of like somebody's life, and that is meant to be a snapshot at the time, and then also grow and change as the person does. So it
Mm,
is a snapshot of the person's history, what they want in their lives, what they look forward to in their lives,
and
it
how
can,
other people see them.
right.
Right. So if you think about birthday cards, what if instead of on your birthday, instead of getting a sappy Hallmark card, somebody gave you a card that said, this is how true I see you. And it's, I don't know, full of like honeybees and beautiful wildflowers. And you're like, whoa, you saw my soul. Or if you go through an important life transition and now you have a photo of you and your child or something like that, and that you make your own decks that represent who you are. And now these become conversational tools, right? Rather
yeah.
than a deck off the shelf. How everybody talks about like, oh, maybe I should make a tarot deck. But I think what we're really saying is, oh, maybe I can make something that expresses who I am to the world. And it doesn't
Yeah.
have to be as complicated as tarot. What if we were able to visually represent our stories to each
Yeah.
other? And when I'm overwhelmed, instead of being like, I don't know what to say, I can be like, here's a piece of my heart. This is how I'm feeling right now. And so Moth wants me to write a book about this.
I mean,
Right,
that would be an excellent fourth entry in this thing, like a
Yeah.
guide
right.
to how
So
to build your own.
conceptually, like what I imagined then as sort of like my brain outgrowth of like this concept is a book that talked you through a bunch of exercises that sort of like loosely starts with a sort of taroistic framework, but goes through exercises where you're kind of scrapbooking yourself
Yeah.
out of cards,
Yeah.
Yeah.
right?
That
And
sounds
my
great.
my and my imagination has it like the way that people use Khalil Gibran poetry. You open to a random thing and like put your finger in, and that's the thing that is meant for this moment.
Yeah.
Um, to kind of use it that way, like you flip open, like you don't read it linearly because it's a workbook, but you also don't fill it in linearly. You
Yeah.
open it up, point it to the thing, and then it gives you sort of like kind of choose your own adventure style. Here's, if you feel good about this card, go do this one next. If you feel something else about this card, or like go do this one next, or let the fates decide and flip through.
Yeah.
Everything
More,
you're saying about this is like, yes, this sounds great. Yes, yes, this sounds great.
and I
So,
do think this is both super serious and also a game.
yeah, I mean, it is,
Right.
game is a small word, but it
Uh-huh.
encompasses so many activities that people do for all sorts of pleasure. It
Yeah.
is which is much, that is a much wider envelope than like you roll the die and you move your mouse 3 spaces and you put
Right.
another thing on the mousetrap. I mean, that is also a game, but
Right.
it is a very small word to contain such a large amount of things. We could clearly continue talking for a while here, but I think we've gone over an hour already, so I want to move toward wrapping up. Is there anything that you want to say for sure about the game before I ask you where um, people can get it? Where can people find it? Where can people find you? Is there anything else final thoughts on this project and I like to ask about what's next, but it sounds like you guys already know what you're going to maybe do next, or like you're
Oh
going to
no,
have
there's
to
more
push
next.
each
Oh,
other
there's
Yeah,
so
into
there's
much
it.
more next.
You want to hear the quick rundown of what's next?
Oh God, there's so much next.
You go on. You
There's
want me to
so
go
much
first?
next. Go
Okay.
first.
Well, Metatopia is coming up, as you mentioned earlier, and that's a lovely deadline. I am pitching a small LARP that I might submit for Golden Cobra that's called Rule of Three, which is a age-inclusive, family-friendly LARP that teaches and runs off of the frames of fairy tales, the repeating patterns of three to help young children and mixed age groups tell creative stories together. So I think it'll probably have some things you may see as familiar from Old Ways Must Go in there, where it's really just a set of constraints designed to help people tell stories together. Um, and I should have a much more finished copy of a game I started last year that's called White Space, which is a game about how stories decay over time and how the tools of the archive shape what is remembered and how credibility and power influence those things.
This
So
is
again, very much a thinking framework game.
None of those words surprise me after talking to you for an hour now. Like I'm like, yeah, that of course that's another thing you're working on. Of course it
Yes, so
is.
that is called White Space, which
Hmm,
is commentary on several things, including
yeah,
the space outside the words in a story, and
sure,
also sort of like dominant culture and how we over preference certain things in culture and under preference others. And
absolutely.
then we're gonna do some panels. Well, I'm gonna do some panels on accessibility. We want to do like a rapid fire improv style workshop that I'm calling probably Duck Duck Octopus, where we take Duck Duck Goose and we have people think about frameworks for inclusivity for different types of inclusivity, whether that's sensory or age or physical mobility, and iterate on the game together with there really being permission to both come up with what does it mean to create an inclusive game, but really to get people and game designers thinking about how do you make your game more accessible on the fly. When somebody walks up and says, I want to play this game, but I can't because it's a walking game and I can't walk, or it's a talking game and I'm nonverbal, and to create a permissive space for that is kind of my hope there.
Yeah.
So that's my immediate next step.
I'm working on a game called Kirby Cryptids Roller Jam, which is
Like,
about
I
cryptids
mean,
playing roller derby.
yeah, yeah. Is
But cryptids who are like in like essentially like heavily femmed out like
I mean,
drag
this
kind of
this
like
isn't.
cryptid.
I mean, there's a lot of art that makes cryptids sexy, but I believe Curvy Cryptids is like that artist has been.
Yeah,
You're
Yes,
like
working with the
that,
artist that
yes,
calls themselves Curvy
straightforward
Cryptids,
pinup
right?
art,
yeah.
but like cryptids. Yeah, like we had a really lovely conversation at the start of that project. Like, what does this art mean? And Laura was like, gender is drag. Cryptids with boobs is my interpretation of that. And I'm like, that's rad. Let's make them play roller derby. This is awesome. This is
Yeah.
such a and it's kind of become a real-time dice game like over the course of development of it.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay.
yeah.
I think I've seen some hints of that on the internet somewhere. So looking forward to that.
The other one that I'm sort of kind of just getting the packaging design done for is a trick-taking game that I designed a long time ago, actually, called Kung Fu Kittens. and it is sort of like loosely based on, again, Avatar: The Last Airbender, but like retheming it with kittens because licenses. I can't be bothered. Um, Turns out I make art games.
Yeah. Also, yeah, I mean, people like cats.
People like cats.
People like
So
cats.
my plan is this is my sellout cat game that allows me to retire on, decks of cards.
Well,
This is probably a terrible plan, but like,
I
I'll
mean,
burn that bridge when I come to it.
I've heard worse plans.
There are
So
worse plans out there, to be
there are
sure.
worse plans than that. Well, good luck to all of you, but to both of you on all of your future projects. Please close us out by telling us where people can find you on the internet if they want to back some of these future projects, read about Old Ways Must Go Now, find you if they want to, they love this idea and they want to chat to you about it. Like any place that you want to be found, please tell the viewers where those places are for each of you.
Sure. I'm at ogreteeth on basically the useful socials, which for me are Instagram and BlueSky. Um, you can find all of these things over at galileogames.com. The newsletter is published on a roughly monthly basis, and that is where you get the deets.
I am largely a do not perceive me cryptid. So other than some tiny Discord communities, you don't see me much on the socials.
And
However,
that's totally
I
fine.
have a website. It is nerdsomatics.life. And my itch is also nerd somatics.
All right.
Yeah.
That's great. I want to thank you again both for coming and giving me so much of your time today to talk about we've had a wide-ranging conversation and it could have gone more. I'm only cutting it off arbitrarily because we've been talking for a while. So thank you so much. And I want to thank all the viewers who've watched this and change your life around, make it better.
That's right. Change your life or we'll make it better for you.
Yep.
Participate in the creation of your own better life.
That's right. You're going to have agency by the time we're done with you, whether you like it or not.
Wow, that's a slogan. That's a slogan. All right. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.